Okay, we're coming up to our exam this week. I've realized that there's more material than I expected left over. However, we do kind of owe an extra class because we had that election day thing that is now using up today's class. Doesn't really affect us because of the fact that we're doing our Monday classes online anyway. However, there was a few holidays in there, so this will likely be split into two. We'll just make it two videos, or it might be a little bit longer than the 35 minutes that I usually put out. We'll see how it goes. One of the reasons is chapter 6 we never quite finished. So although the title today is the American Century, let's just finish off what happens in the United Kingdom. We don't really talk that much about the British in the 20th century, simply because that's when America becomes a superpower, and that's the period which Koreans are most familiar with American culture, and we have been talking about British culture all along since day one. So just to wrap up what we say about British culture, these are the main things that you need to know that are from the textbook from chapter 6, okay? So remember, in our last in-person class, I emphasized the fact that sea power was really the means by which the British Empire became the empire that never sets, going around the world and including a quarter of the population and 20% of the landmass of the earth. Impossible to do with just their army. It was the Navy that really allowed them to be so dominant and to extend their power farther than any country had done to that point. Now, we discussed in class that what we have these days are not empires in the technical sense, but we do have these gigantic nation states that extend their power economically and militarily all over the world. America and China being the most powerful of them, but Russia also, extending its influence over the rest of the world. The half of Asia, China, extending its power into Africa, and the United States everywhere, everywhere that China and Russia is not. We are going to talk about the Cold War era. None of us were alive during that, but that is within the actual personal living memory of a lot of people, because that period, the Cold War, was within the last 100 years. Most of this course doesn't talk about stuff within living memory because it's people are sensitive about it. It becomes too personal and political for a professor to talk about without having too much bias. So we are going to come up sort of to the present, but sort of gently, slow down and leave the strands and the outcomes of what we've learned to your interpretation, application, and own decision, okay? However, we can say confidently, whether you like Napoleon or not, he lost the war and he's been dead for 200 years. He's one of the most popular people ever. Thousands of biographies have been written about him. He was never defeated by Nelson in person. That was the Duke of Waterloo, the Iron Duke, who we will not talk about. He was defeated at Waterloo by the Iron Duke, rather. But we're not going to talk about him. We're not going to talk about Wellesley, the Duke who defeated him, defeated his army at the Battle of Waterloo. Instead, before 1815, long before that, in 1805, Nelson was an Yi Sun-shin type person, incredibly brave and talented and strategic and admired, feared, confident, unbeatable, undefeated, unbelievably dangerous, I guess you could say. He was an admiral, a vice admiral in the military. He captained a ship called the HMS Victory, which was a good name, and that ship sailed for almost 100 years, and that was his flagship. And these are ships much bigger than the ships that Yi Sun-shin was using, even the turtle ships or the Panok-sun. These are 100-gun ships of the line that have 1,000 sailors on them each. They're like they're bigger than tanks. They're sea monsters, and they literally blow each other to pieces before, and often they don't sink. So you blow the other thing to pieces, but it's still floating. So you attach a rope to it, and you pull it home and you repair it. They're made of gigantic 200-year-old oak trees. Fascinating stuff if you're an engineer. If any of you happen to be interested in ships or I don't know, military history or anything, even if you're interested in wood, they're just engineering masterpieces. As were the Kabuk-sun and the Panok-sun, the turtle ships and the Korean ships that fought in Yi Sun-shin's fleet. They also were much superior. The difference is Nelson was actually fighting French ships and Spanish ships that were similarly constructed, but he had a better crew, more trained. His strategy was better. His tactics were better. He had all of the commanding advantages and personnel advantages, where Yi Sun-shin also had different ships than the Japanese, which so his battles are even more lopsided. Yi Sun-shin wipes out everybody and doesn't lose a single person, that kind of stuff. So Nelson's battling against Napoleon's ships, but unlike some people may not realize, Napoleon was never a ship captain and never had control of the navy. He had a navy under his command, so they never actually fought each other. But Nelson at Trafalgar in 1805 defeated the combined Spanish and French, it could be Spanish and French fleet. When that fleet was destroyed, Napoleon couldn't get to the United Kingdom. So Nelson became, whatever Napoleon did on Europe, he couldn't defeat the United Kingdom because he couldn't get there. So Nelson died and had one of the biggest funerals, in British history, along with Princess Diana, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Winston Churchill. Funeral procession with hundreds of thousands of people coming out. Queen Elizabeth II, most recently. In the book, it talks about Nelson because he used flags to communicate, and he was so admired and he was so influential that basically they kept everything they could, as long as they could, in the Nelson tradition. So they've got radios and stuff, and they have smoke flares, and they have ships that can fire 20 kilometers away instead of 300 meters cannons. They've got these guns that can shoot like bombs the size of small cars 25 kilometers away, and they're still waving flags at each other like it's 1805. And that's because they don't want to get rid of the the magic aura of invincibility. Nelson famously ran the signals up that he expects everyone to do their duty, right? And the duty is to die for your country. Extreme patriotism. And they were willing to do that because they figured some of us are going to die, but we're going to win. So I'm fighting for this guy. Yi Sun-shin had the same kind of charisma. His men, he had unquestioning loyalty from his men. That's why sometimes people call Yi Sun-shin the Nelson of Korea, saved Korea from Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And you could say Nelson is the Yi Sun-shin of the United Kingdom. He saved the United Kingdom from the British, from Napoleon. Now, after, a few decades after Nelson was gone, and things were pretty settled in the middle of the British peace, we have this queen that comes along called Victoria, who lives forever, has lots of children, and she has a certain conservative, sort of domestic female attitude, policy. And so the British Empire settles into this sort of stable, conservative culture, which we call Victorianism. On the surface, everything seems like gentlemen and ladies and wealthy people and ships like the Titanic, and champagne glasses and beautiful pianos. But I mean, Victorianism is very famous for its sort of conservatism on the top, and I mean everything, like women's rights or sexuality or manners or politics or whatever. It's a conservative dominated culture, and it settles into this sort of imperial culture, which is stable and justifies itself by being civilized. And civilized is doing things the British way. This is where all this British soft power comes from. It's basically the Victorians sort of let this she's not ugly, but not Queen Elizabeth I, like tall, orange hair, slim and regal looking, kind of like short and round. And because her Prince Albert, her German Prince Albert, who she loved very dearly, passed away long before she did. The last 20 years of her reign is her wearing black all the time and never smiling. So it's just, it's a kind of subdued mood. And meanwhile, you've got, the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace they build, industrialization is happening. You're making machines, and you've got these incredibly wealthy, luxurious people, and you've got a new class of people with money, these businessmen that are super rich, the ancestors of our Jeff Bezos, Zuckerbergs, and in their basically their American contemporaries who are even wealthier, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, Stanford, Duke, and so on, right? These guys that they're thousands and thousands of times richer than a normal person is, right? I remember looking at this one time when I was in university. It was a thing, Tiger Woods, and we get paid per hour, right? I had a part-time job. I was working $10 an hour or something on my part-time job. So every hour, ding, $10. But they had this clock on a website that was showing Tiger Woods salary over a year divided. It was a clock that was just counting by the second how much money Tiger Woods was making per second, and it was like it was something like $700 per second. I can't remember, but it was just like the clock was ticking, and like you watch it for an hour, and it would be it would be $355,000 an hour, something like that, right? So the guy's making thousands of times, 10,000, 100,000 times more money than I was per hour. And I mean, I suck at golf, so I'm not going to get $300,000 per hour. I'm just saying, this Victorian culture was very poor people and very rich people. These are the common themes of Charles Dickens. You have to read a little bit about his, you know some of his writing. Tale of Two Cities is about the French Revolution. A Christmas Carol is about Scrooge, the greedy guy on Christmas Eve. Oliver Twist, probably the most famous one. Maybe one that please sir, I want some more. The abject poverty of some people, and the outrageous rich, excessive luxurious life of the rich. Victorianism has those contrasts, but Victoria represents that stable upper class that belongs there. You remember all the way back to the chain of being. It's almost like Victoria stabilizes the chain of being again. After all those years since the Black Death and, everybody getting wages going up because there was not enough labor, now we're back to, you're rich because you were born rich. And so they have a problem a little bit with these guys that become industrialists, and they're dirt poor, like Andrew Carnegie, and they go to the United States and they have 5 pennies in their pocket, and then they become the richest man in the world. Victorians don't really like that. Dickens writes about that Victorian contradiction. Jane Austen, you probably know because she's one of the earliest great female writers, and she writes about female society at the turn of the 19th century, around the time Napoleon is dominating Europe. Jane Austen is writing her books in the early 19th century. The Brontes, Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte especially, there is a professor who is an expert on them who will teach you about them perhaps, but they write much more sort of assertive female style, if you even call it that. I think it's more of like people accuse them of writing like crazy men, but in fact if they're crazy, they're crazy women, and they write some of the best books ever written. Jane Eyre is one of them, I think Jane Austen and the Brontes are probably, for women, some of their favorite books. Most Canadians and Americans who like literature like those two groups of people. There's the Brontes have a whole family. There's 3 ladies. Anne Bronte also writes. So these are writers from the English literature department, just to introduce to you. Dickens is easy to read, but long. But lots of his books have been made into novels. Lots of his books are novels that have been made into movies. So you can watch the movie if you want. I don't know what I'm talking about today. I'm sunburned and out of sorts. Mark Twain, not the best American writer, I will say. My favorite is got to be Sir Edgar Allan Poe. And there's other choices if you like Hemingway or David Foster Wallace or somebody else who's really respected. But regardless, Mark Twain made his own style that it's unique, and it's essentially American. It's got comedy and satire, and it includes characters of different races, and it addresses the inheritance of the greatest contradiction. It talks about a runaway slave and a runaway kid, Huckleberry Finn. right? So can't go wrong with that. A difficult topic for anybody to handle deftly. But he does it with I think a very, very subtle touch, and even if he never wrote anything else, Huckleberry Finn sort of stands alone. So actually, since I've been talking about this stuff for going on about it, maybe I'll cut the video off there, and I'll do all the American stuff together at the same time and publish that as a separate video. So we'll keep things organized. Okay, so stay tuned for the next part about the American century.